Today's historical revisionist on the religious right oftentimes will try to portray the situation as, well, you had some government officials who wrote this Constitution, and religious leaders were all upset, and they wanted there to be Christian language in the Constitution. They favored that. As a matter of fact, there were a lot of religious leaders all throughout the colonies who were very worried about the idea of the government trying to have a say in religion and promoting religion because they knew the dangers that that would create. Remember, the individuals coming out of this historical context had two very vivid examples of the problems of combining church and state. First was Europe. They had seen and read and they knew about the European experience. Hundreds of years of war and bloodshed because of religion. People fighting, slaughters, war, violence, and terror because of individuals presuming to tell others what they should or should not believe about religion. That was one example they were familiar with. More intimately, they were also familiar with examples in some of the colonies. Remember, Massachusetts Bay Colony was founded as a theocratic state. The Mayflower Compact setting up this sort of religious state. And people were fined, or they were punished, or they were imprisoned, or otherwise punished for not believing in religion or practicing religion in a way that the Puritan theocracy believed it should be practiced. In Puritan Massachusetts, you could be fined if you spoke to a minister in disrespect, if you failed to go to services on Sunday, if you worked on the Sabbath, if you cursed. Lots of things could happen to you because you broke the religious rules. And some states followed this model, some colonies, I should say, followed this model and had these combinations of religion and government. And it really wasn't until the period of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and afterwards that states began to do away with this model and began to separate church and state in their own regard. My point is that the founders were aware of the problems that the combination of religion and government had caused in the colonies. In Virginia, for example, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison worked together to disestablish the Anglican Church, in part because they saw the effect that was having on members of other faiths. There's one letter where Madison speaks very eloquently and with great force. He writes to a friend about witnessing preachers, probably Baptist preachers, in jail in Orange County, Virginia. What was their crime? They had dared to preach openly on the street. And Madison was just incensed that this could happen. He thought he was living in an enlightened era and was just furious that the government would presume to put people in jail because they preached a doctrine on the street that conflicted with what the state held to be orthodox. So he didn't just carp. He worked with Jefferson to change the situation. You probably are familiar with Jefferson's favorite statute for religious freedom, which he tried to get passed and failed, but Madison pushed it through the legislature some years later while Jefferson was living in France. And that law is a very important one because it was really the influence on the First Amendment, more so than you hear the religious right say, well, the Bible or the Ten Commandments. There's really no evidence of those religious documents affecting our Constitution, but the Virginia statute, which guarantees all people the right to worship as they see fit, obviously you see an echo of that in our First Amendment, which establishes separation of church and state. So that's really the first piece of evidence. The contemporary times of the Constitution, the founding period, the document itself. I can't tell you how many times I've been on a talk radio show or some other format where I hear a religious right person will call up and say, well, the Constitution says we're a Christian nation. And the answer to that simply is, where does it say that? And it doesn't say it, and they can't point to any language. The best they can come up with is a pro forma passage at the end where the document is dated in the year of our Lord, which was a standard way of dating documents at that time, and is still, in fact, even used today. I would tend to think that if the framers intended to make this a Christian nation, they would have stated that up front without any hesitation in the document. They would not have tried to imply that by using a pro forma reference of the year of our Lord. Well, what did the framers think about unions of church and state? Let me go into that a little more detail because I've sort of touched on that. The European experience, the colonial experience. But there were other incidents and things that happened, especially during the colonial time, that are worth looking at. One is the famous situation in Virginia. Virginia was an unusual case because they had this Anglican church that had a lot of power, yet more and more people were sort of drifting away from that denomination. Yet it continued to basically run the show. One of the most famous documents in American history, or should be one of the most famous documents, is something that Madison wrote called the Memorial and Remonstrance Against Religious Assessments. It's essentially a list of reasons why government and church should not be combined, why church and state should not be combined. Let me just read to you a little passage from the Memorial and Remonstrance, because it's a very important document to be familiar with. This is James Madison. It is proper to take alarm at the first experiment on our liberties. Who does not see that the same authority which can establish Christianity, in exclusion of all other religions, may establish with the same ease any particular sect of Christians, in exclusion of all other sects? That same authority which can force a citizen to contribute 3 pence only of his property for the support of any one establishment may force him to conform to any other establishment in all cases whatsoever. Now that passage is important because it points out something I think is overlooked today. When the religious right talks about the so-called Christian nation idea, they sometimes have this idea that there was a kind of generalized, generic Christianity that most people were rallying around in the colonial period, and most people would have agreed with, and that this is really what the framers meant to endorse or to put their stamp on. But Madison's own words sort of debunk that, because he talks about, you can establish Christianity. What's to stop you from establishing a particular sect of Christianity? And that's an important point to remember, because it underscores the fact that even at that time, the differences between the religious denominations were stark. Some were more literal in their interpretation, more fundamentalist. Others were less so. There was also a sort of thought of religious thinking, of deism, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. But you had these differences of opinion among even the so-called Christian denominations. Just like today, we have all this different diversity of opinion among Christian groups. That same thing existed back then. So it wasn't an acceptable thing for a Baptist to have to pay taxes to support the Anglican Church. The Baptist wasn't going to say, that's no big deal. They're Christian too. We pretty much believe the same thing. No, they didn't feel that way. The Anglicans' doctrines were not acceptable to the Baptist, and vice versa, and the Presbyterians felt differently, and the Methodists and the Lutherans and the Unitarians and the Catholics, and there were some number of them in the country. They didn't agree. And of course, we're now getting into the question of what about the small numbers of Jews that were in the nation, and the numbers of people who would have been free thinkers or whatever they would have considered themselves. They had rights too. And when you read the founders and when you read what they're saying about religion, they clearly debunk the idea that there was a generic form of Christianity that the country would seek to rally around or establish or promote. And I think Madison's phrase in Memorial and Remonstrance is very important.